So just kind of continuing on the whole, trying to bring people to your side, trying to get this change enacted. When we look maybe historically, even with examples, when are dissidents at their strongest? And then when are they at their weakest, whether it be with tactics, whether it be with traits, that kind of thing? Like what has
Yeah,
worked and then what has failed?
right. No, it's a really good question, and you know, I think that in those moments when dissidents can sort of find other people who share their concerns, who share their way of looking at the world, and can actually, kind of grow. I think that they're most effective. Let me give you just like a concrete example
Yeah.
from the book, which there was this in the 1970s in Argentina. There was disappearances of leftist activists by the government. They would literally come in the night and take people away and then actually murder them in really brutal ways. Um, and and I wrote about the mothers of these people who were often there witnessing these disappearances when they took place, and sort of what they were sort of the position that they were forced into, right? So when something like this happens and you live in an environment of such fear, right, where your natural instinct is probably to say like, let me not make a big deal of it, right? The other option, or let me not try to sort of pursue where my kid is, because in many of these instances, they just didn't know. This was in the mid 1970s. But the other option is to start like knocking on doors, right? To start going to government offices. And so some of these women did this. And while they were doing it, they began to see that there were other women who were also, engaged in the same search that they were. And and they began to join forces together. Said in the quietest of ways, they said, you know what, let's meet every week in the square across the street from the government offices, just to sort of share information. And then there'll be strength also in numbers, right? And so this became eventually over time, over a period of months and then years, into a massive movement called the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, which was the square where they were all meeting. And to me, it's a wonderful, and it created this incredible force of shame on the government, right? Because here were these mothers, they would come every week at the same time. First there were 50, then there were 100, then there were hundreds of them. They had like a uniform that they wore these white kerchiefs on their heads with the names of their children embroidered on them who were still disappeared. They didn't know where, they didn't have any information about them. And they would meet for an hour, every week and just circle the square, silently. And it became such an incredible force of shame on the government and, in the eyes of the rest of the world, in the eyes of their own people, that it was one of the precipitating factors in this, authoritarianism sort of falling apart. And I think to me, it's a great example of sort of when dissidents can kind of discover each other, and really hone in on a message that in this case was as simple as you could possibly imagine. It wasn't even political. It was, I want to know what happened to my child. So I mean, that's an important lesson too, I think, for dissidents is thinking about their cause in the most human elemental level. So sometimes we're so trapped inside of our sort of political ideologies that we forget that they're actually, and Minneapolis was a great example of this, but we forget that there are these sort of like common elements, that as humans we respond to. My neighbor is being mistreated. A mother loves their child and their child isn't there, like, or has been taken, a basic injustice that speaks, I think, to most people, of goodwill, is something that a dissident has to be really attuned to.
And that kind of might go into what my next question was going to be. I wanted to kind of tie it into today a little more,
Yeah.
where, because I think now almost more, I'm young, so I don't want to say more so than ever before, because, I've only lived through so many presidential elections, but it feels that both sides electorally have moved towards, dissidents shouldn't have a voice. Like, we want you ultimately to fall in line and vote with our party. Not, we don't specifically have to be on this issue, but I think of like the pro-Palestinian movement. Trump was throwing people people in jail who were protesting for
Right.
Palestine. But then even on the left, like a Palestinian voice didn't get to speak at the DNC. So like on both sides, you kind of have this like, well, if you're going to speak out against something that maybe makes us look bad, we'll keep you from institutional power. I'm just curious how you think dissidents should move with the kind of political landscape being like that, to where obviously it's important, but you still have to get people on your side to make that change.
Yeah, no, it is incredibly challenging, and I think what a lot of people have been learning how to do is to create their own sites of speaking, of engagement that are outside of these institutional and elite places, because I think if they are confident that they're speaking to, again, those sort of human elemental aspects of injustice, of freedom, then then they can really reach people, outside of the gatekeepers. I mean, it is something, we talked before about social media, but it is something that is kind of remarkable and positive, I think, for all the negative aspects, that it sort of speeds us up and it makes us too loud and too distracted. There are opportunities to speak outside of those sort of controlling elements. I was doing some reporting this week about Hungary, and because I was asking myself, like, Orban, Viktor Orban, the prime minister of Hungary, had been in charge for 15 years. He was polarizing people there the way that Trump does here, which was like, if you supported Orban, it wasn't just that you supported like his issues or his ideology, like you were an Orban person, just like you're like a MAGA person, right?
Mhm.
And so how did people like break out of that? Both like actually literally like separate out from their like social circles to be able to say like, okay, I'm willing to accept a change, or willing to think about myself as a citizen first, and not just like a member of this loyal group of people.
Mhm.
But then also like Orban like literally had control over like 80% of the media. So how could they even get information? Like to your question of like this like stronghold, and um so it was interesting because, on the media question, like a lot of these people, Orban thought he had power because he had like 80% of the media, but we're talking about like newspapers and television and radio. But like almost everybody in Hungary is on Facebook and TikTok. So
Yeah.
so they were all having this like side conversation that he wasn't even part of.
Mhm.
A similar thing happened with the pro-Palestinian movement, by the way. Like a lot of that sort of bubbled up on TikTok, like
Yeah.
far away from mainstream media, right? So that was one way that people kind of made an end run around this sort of Orban identity. And the other was this fascinating thing I discovered, which is about like 2 years ago in rural communities. So, the like equivalent of like the Kansas and Kentucky of Hungary, these small like civic groups started forming, which were, they called them islands, actually. That was like the name they had for them. And they didn't do like political things at first. These are people who were clearly like dissatisfied in some way, just like there might be like Trump voters who are like, I don't like the direction of the country, but I'm not going to turn against Trump, right?
Yeah.
But they were dissatisfied, but they were also, so not willing to sacrifice that identity. But what they started doing is all kinds of just like civic activity. Like they would do like trash cleanup and like painting the benches in town and like movie nights, but also they had like, it was also kind of a debate society. They would talk about like the local factory that's like polluting and they're not happy about it, or the schools. And these became the centers of opposition to Orban. Like it gave people a chance to begin to tiptoe away from their like very strongly identified, politically identified personas towards like being citizens who actually have the ability to choose who should be in power, not just accept, as most of them had, that like he was just going to be leader for life. So I'm very heartened when I hear something like that, because like I think in our world, like it feels so polarized. Our identities are so fixed. Those elite institutions feel so closed that it's hard to sort of think about how you tiptoe away from that, that sort of heaviness.